Fox filmed it. Fox finished it. And then Fox buried it so deep that, for 13 years, most fans thought it never existed at all. No press release. No explanation. Just a hole in the schedule where an episode should have been. It was called I'll See You in Court, and it was ready to air in February of 1989. Then, days before broadcast, it vanished. Not edited. Not delayed. Erased from the lineup entirely, as if the network wanted everyone to forget it was ever made. It would take more than a decade, a cable channel nobody expected, and a culture that had finally caught up, before audiences got to see what Fox was so afraid of. This is the story of the episode that got too real for a show that was already too much. To understand why one episode of Married with Children scared a network, you have to understand what that network was trying to do in the first place. When Fox launched in 1986, it wasn't trying to compete with ABC, NBC, and CBS by playing it safe. It was the fourth guy at the table, and the only way to get noticed was to be loud. Married with Children, which premiered in April of 1987, was built for exactly that job. It took the warm, tidy sitcom family that had dominated television for a decade and set it on fire. Al Bundy was a miserable shoe salesman who despised his customers, his job, and most days, his own life. Peg Bundy didn't cook, didn't clean, and spent her days parked in front of the television demanding her husband work harder so she wouldn't have to. Kelly and Bud weren't lovable scamps. They were self-interested, a little cruel to each other, and completely unbothered by it. There were no life lessons at the end of the episode. There was no swelling music. There was just the joke, landing as hard as the writers could make it land. Audiences loved it. Critics were split, and the show quickly built a reputation as one of the crudest things on network television, which for Fox was the point. It gave the network an identity in a crowded field, and it gave viewers something they hadn't been offered before: permission to laugh at the parts of family life nobody put on screen. But that formula came with risk built in. A show that makes its name by pushing past what's comfortable is always one script away from pushing too far. And in the show's third season, that's exactly what happened. The episode was titled I'll See You in Court, and it was written by Gene Baruch and Gene Romano, two writers new to the show, and directed by Jerry Cohen. The premise sounds almost tame by the standards of what the series had already aired. Peg, inspired by a talk show, decides she and Al need to reignite their sex life, and on a friend's suggestion, books them a room at a rundown motel called the Hop-On Inn. When they arrive, they find a videotape sitting in the room, and assuming it's meant for them, they pop it in expecting something romantic. Instead, they discover it's a tape of their neighbors, Steve and Marcy Rhodes, caught in an intimate moment at the very same motel. The joke curdles fast when Al and Peg realize the room is wired the same way, and that they too have likely been secretly filmed without their knowledge or consent. What starts as a raunchy sitcom setup turns into something with real teeth. Two couples suing a motel for videotaping them without permission, and a courtroom storyline where the tapes themselves become evidence, dissected in humiliating detail in front of a judge and jury. It was shot on January 6, 1989, and slated to air on February 19. On paper, this was one more entry in a show that had already built entire episodes around sexual jokes, marital dysfunction, and characters being mocked and humiliated for laughs. But this one carried something the others didn't. A plot rooted in non-consensual surveillance, secretly recorded intimacy, and a legal system asked to referee a violation that felt uncomfortably plausible. In the late 1980s, hidden cameras in motel rooms weren't science fiction. It was the kind of thing that showed up in local news segments and made people genuinely uneasy. The show wasn't just joking about sex anymore. It was joking about being watched without your knowledge, having that footage exist somewhere outside your control, and having no real way to get justice for it. That's a very different kind of discomfort than a dirty punchline, and it landed at Fox's censorship desk at the worst possible moment. Because while I'll See You in Court was in production, Married with Children was already fighting for its life in the press. A Michigan mother named Terry Ricalta had caught an earlier episode that season, Her Cups Runneth Over, in which Al and his neighbor Steve go shopping for a discontinued style of bra, and she was appalled by what she saw. Ricalta didn't just complain to a friend or fire off an angry letter to Fox. She started writing directly to the show's advertisers, urging them to pull their money out And it worked. Major national companies dropped their sponsorships, and by early 1989, the story had become national news. Ricolta was profiled in magazines and interviewed on television, cast as the concerned mother taking on a network that had lost its moral compass. For Fox, still a young, financially fragile operation trying to prove to Madison Avenue that it could be trusted with big ad budgets, this was a genuine crisis, not just bad press. That's the environment I'll See You in Court walked into. Every script on the show was suddenly getting extra scrutiny from Fox's broadcast standards department, with objections and rewrite requests piling up on lines that would have sailed through a year earlier. According to the show's own creators, this episode in particular ran into trouble over its courtroom sequence, where the Bundy's brief and awkward tape is played back in slow motion for the jury, milking the humiliation for laughs. Producers and the network went back and forth over how far they could push it, and eventually, an agreement couldn't be reached. Rather than gut the episode into something unrecognizable, the decision was made to shelve it entirely. It wasn't formally canceled. It wasn't destroyed. It simply stopped being on the schedule, with no public explanation offered to viewers who had no idea it had ever been filmed in the first place. For the people who made it, the whole thing was strange precisely because nothing about the shoot itself had felt unusual. The cast rehearsed and performed it like any other week on one of the rowdiest sets on television. According to the show's co-creator Michael Moy speaking years later about the fallout, the process felt almost absurd in hindsight, with network standards executives combing over every single word of the script during the height of the Ricolta backlash, objecting to jokes that had nothing to do with the sex tape plot at all. He also noted that the episode wasn't the first casualty of that period. An earlier episode, nicknamed The Camping Show, built around jokes about menstruation, had also been pulled temporarily around the same time. I'll See You in Court simply became the one that stayed gone. For years afterward, it existed mostly as a rumor among devoted fans. It wasn't included in the show's syndication package, it wasn't part of early home video releases, and it didn't appear in the episode guides that circulated in fan magazines. If you'd started watching the show a season or two after it aired, there was a real chance you'd never even hear that it existed. Those who did know about it were left piecing together secondhand accounts, since there was no official statement from Fox confirming what had happened to it, or whether it still existed at all. That silence is exactly what let the lost episode reputation grow. The less anyone said about it, the more mysterious it became. The episode didn't come back because of a campaign or a leak. It came back because television itself had changed. By the early 2000s, cable networks were operating under a completely different set of standards than broadcast TV had in 1989. Shows like The Sopranos and South Park had already normalized content that would have been unthinkable on network television a decade earlier, and FX, which had by then picked up the syndication rights to the entire Married with Children library, decided the time had come to finally air it. On June 18, 2002, more than 13 years after it was originally supposed to premiere, I'll See You in Court finally aired in the United States for the first time, as part of FX's regular rerun rotation. Even then, it wasn't shown completely untouched. Several lines were still trimmed for the broadcast, meaning the FX airing was the show's first public appearance, but not yet its most complete one. Fans who had only heard whispers about the episode for over a decade were suddenly watching it play out on an ordinary weekday afternoon, with no fanfare and no announcement beforehand. Early internet forums lit up almost immediately as longtime viewers realized what they were watching. It wasn't a rerun of a familiar episode. It was the one that wasn't supposed to exist. The full, unedited version of I'll See You in Court eventually made its way onto the Season 3 DVD box set, restoring the handful of lines that FX had trimmed, and giving fans the first chance to see the episode exactly as it was filmed back in January of 1989. In the years since, it's also become available through streaming, meaning an episode that Fox once wouldn't put on air at all is now just a click away for anyone with a subscription. Here's the part that still trips people up when they finally watch it. On its own, I'll See You in Court isn't shocking by the standards of the show it came from. Married with Children built its entire identity on crude jokes, and by the time this episode was shot, the series had already aired plenty of material that pushed just as hard, if not harder. So why did this specific episode get pulled when so many others didn't? The honest answer has less to do with the content of the episode itself and more to do with timing. Fox wasn't reviewing this script in a vacuum. It was reviewing it in the middle of a nationally covered advertiser boycott, with sponsors actively pulling their money and reporters actively looking for the network's next misstep. A storyline about secretly recorded, non-consensual footage of a couple's intimate life, then replayed for laughs in a courtroom, was simply too easy a target for critics who were already accusing the show of exploiting its audience. It wasn't that the jokes were dirtier than usual. It's that the premise itself, being filmed without your knowledge and having that footage become a public spectacle, touched a nerve that felt uncomfortably real, at a moment when Fox had zero appetite for another controversy. Pulling the episode wasn't a moral judgment about its content so much as a business decision made under pressure, in real time, by a network trying to survive its first real brush with a national boycott. What's genuinely interesting about I'll See You in Court today isn't just that it got banned. It's how differently the premise reads now compared to 1989. Back then, the idea of secretly being filmed in a private moment was an unsettling but relatively rare concern, mostly associated with sketchy motels and tabloid scandals. Watching two sitcom characters try and fail to get justice for exactly that kind of violation was uncomfortable because it felt like a strange, isolated nightmare scenario. Decades later, the discomfort hasn't gone away, but the context around it has changed enormously. Non-consensual recording and distribution of intimate footage is no longer a rare motel horror story. It's a documented, widespread problem tied to smartphones, hidden devices, and online distribution, one that lawmakers and platforms are still actively trying to figure out how to address. Watching the Bundys get laughed out of court by a system that treats their violation as a punchline hits differently now than it did in 1989, precisely because the underlying fear the episode is built around has become so much more familiar to modern audiences. That doesn't mean the episode was ahead of its time in some deliberate, prophetic way. Sitcom writers in 1989 weren't predicting smartphone culture. But it does mean the episode aged into a relevance nobody involved could have planned for, which is a big part of why it still gets talked about today. More than 3 decades after it was shot, I'll See You in Court has settled into an odd but fitting place in television history. It's not remembered as the single filthiest episode Married with Children ever made, because by the show's own standards, it genuinely wasn't. It's remembered because of what happened to it after the cameras stopped rolling. A network so spooked by a single advertiser boycott that it shelved a finished, paid-for episode rather than risk one more headline. That decision says as much about the fragile state of Fox in 1989 as it does about the content of the episode itself. It also offers a pretty clear before and after snapshot of how much television standards have shifted. An episode that was too risky for broadcast network television in the Reagan era is now sitting on a streaming platform, available on demand, without a single content warning attached that would have felt out of place on the original series. That gap says less about the episode changing and more about everything around it changing instead. The audience got more comfortable with uncomfortable subject matter, prestige cable and streaming normalized the kind of material that used to be unthinkable outside of a video store's back shelf. And the advertiser-driven panic that buried the episode in the first place simply isn't how most of